3 strangers dragged me from my shop that morning, no explanation, just orders. They took me to the mountains to face Benjamin Thorne. Your partner stole from me, Miss Morrison, $300. That debt is now yours. I can pay you back. I don't want your money. I want you to marry me. 1 year, fake marriage. That was the deal. But neither of us expected what happened next. Eleanor Morrison knew the day was going bad long before the men in trail-worn coats pushed open the door to her herb shop in Copper Creek. On the counter lay a ledger with a simple truth written in her own careful hand. Her business partner had cleared out their shared savings and left her holding $300 of debt to men who did not believe in second chances. She stood behind the counter with wintergreen spread out on a drying cloth, trying to steady her breath. The late autumn sun slanted through the dusty windows, touching the jars of dried herbs that lined the shelves. Chamomile for sleep, yarrow for wounds, comfrey for broken bones. She had learned their secrets from her grandmother, a Cherokee woman who had taught her that every plant held a story and every remedy required patience. Patience was something Eleanor had in abundance. Money, however, was not. The bell above the door jangled. 3 men stepped inside, bringing the smell of leather and pine smoke with them. The biggest of the strangers moved forward with the easy confidence of someone who had never been told no. He wore a dark coat that had seen better days, and his boots left prints of mountain mud across her swept floor. He spoke her name in a low, flat voice that made it sound like a judgment. Eleanor Morrison. She looked up from the wintergreen and met his eyes. They were the color of slate, cold and unreadable. That's me. Mr. Thorne wants a word with you. The name hit her like a fist to the stomach. Benjamin Thorne, the mountain trader who owned more trapping lines and timber rights than some small territories. People said his heart was as cold as the ice on Bear Ridge, that he had built his empire on the backs of men who owed him favors and the ruin of those who crossed him. Eleanor had hoped to live her whole life without ever needing his attention. She tried to sound calm when she told the men that she was busy. While she spoke, her hand slid under the counter fingers, searching for the handle of the hunting knife she kept there. Her grandmother had taught her that too. Always have a blade within reach. The mountains did not forgive the unprepared. The tall stranger watched her without moving. His expression never changed, but something flickered in those slate-colored eyes. Recognition, maybe, or respect. It's not a request, Miss Morrison. Behind him, the other 2 men positioned themselves near the door. One was younger, with a scar that ran from his temple to his jaw. The other was older, gray-haired and quiet, the kind of man who had seen enough violence that he did not need to threaten it. Eleanor's fingers found the knife handle. She gripped it tight, feeling the worn leather wrap press into her palm. Then she looked at the ledger on the counter. $300. Her sister Charlotte's medical bills in Missouri were already past due. The landlord had been patient, but patience only stretched so far. She let go of the knife. Give me a moment to lock up. The ride to Bear Ridge took 2 hours. They bound her hands loosely in front of her, more symbol than restraint, and helped her into the back of a wagon that smelled of pine sap and old canvas. The younger man sat across from her, saying nothing while the wagon jolted over ruts and stones. Eleanor spent the journey trying to memorize the path. First they followed Copper Creek west until it bent north toward the high country. Then they climbed a trail she had never seen before, winding between white bark aspens that shivered in the wind. The air grew thinner. Her ears popped. The mountains rose around them like the walls of a cathedral, vast and indifferent. After an hour, she stopped trying to remember the way back. The trail twisted too many times, doubled back on itself, disappeared into thick stands of pine where the sunlight barely reached. If she ran, she would be lost within minutes. If she survived the cold, the wolves would find her. So she sat still and watched the mountains pass. The wagon finally emerged into a wide valley where the land fell away in sweeping curves of brown grass and scattered evergreens. On the far side, perched on a rise above the valley floor, sat a cabin built of heavy logs. Smoke rose from a stone chimney. Windows reflected the afternoon sun like watchful eyes. It looked less like a home and more like a fortress. The men led her inside without ceremony. The front room held a massive fireplace, a table scarred by years of use, and walls lined with maps. She caught glimpses of Surveyor Mark's property boundaries, railroad routes. This was a room where empires were planned. They took her through a narrow hallway to a study. High windows overlooked the valley. Bookshelves climbed to the ceiling packed with ledgers and journals. A desk dominated the center of the room, its surface covered in papers held down by river stones. A man stood with his back to her, hands clasped behind him. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark vest and white shirt. He did not turn right away. Instead, he spoke in a smooth, controlled tone, as if he were commenting on the weather rather than her life. "Your partner stole from me, Miss Morrison." Eleanor's stomach twisted. She had suspected Samuel Grant was hiding something when he came back from Denver 3 months ago with money to expand the shop. He had been too excited, too eager, talking too fast about investors and opportunities. She had wanted to believe him because the alternative meant she had been a fool. "Samuel told me the money came from a merchant in Denver," she said. "Samuel lied." The man turned then, and Eleanor took an involuntary step back. Benjamin Thorne was all sharp lines and steady eyes with a hard jaw and the faintest suggestion of a smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. A thin scar traced his left eyebrow, pale against tanned skin. He looked like someone who had been carved from mountain stone and given just enough humanity to walk among ordinary people. He studied her the way a hawk studies a rabbit. $300, he said. "That's what Samuel borrowed against your shop. He promised to invest it in inventory and return it with interest in 6 months. Instead, he took the money and disappeared into the high passes." "I didn't know." "That doesn't change the debt." Eleanor forced herself to meet his gaze. "I can pay you back. It'll take time, but I can do it." "How long?" She did not have an answer. $300 was more than her shop earned in half a year. Even if she sold everything, worked every day from dawn to dusk, it would take years to clear that debt. And that was assuming no one else came calling for money Samuel owed. Thorne seemed to read the calculation in her silence. He moved to the desk and picked up a folder. Inside were papers covered in neat handwriting. "I have another option for you." Eleanor's hands clenched into fists. She knew what men like him wanted from women like her. She had heard the stories. Young women who owed money older men with power and no conscience. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her mind. "Never let them see you afraid. Fear is blood in the water." "I'm not interested in that kind of arrangement," she said, her voice colder than she felt. To her surprise, Thorne laughed. It was a short, sharp sound, more surprise than humor. "I'm not propositioning you, Miss Morrison. I'm offering you a business deal." He set the folder down and leaned against the desk, arms crossed. The afternoon light caught his face, and for a moment he looked younger than she had first thought. Mid-30s, maybe. Old enough to have built an empire, young enough to still be hungry for more. "My grandmother is dying," he said. The words were blunt, stated without emotion, but something flickered behind his eyes. Pain, maybe, or the memory of it. "I'm sorry," Eleanor said, because it seemed like the thing to say. "Don't be. She's 72 years old, and she's lived more life than most people could imagine. But she has one wish before she dies. She wants to see me married." Eleanor stared at him. Of all the things she had expected him to say, that was not on the list. Thorne continued as if he were discussing a shipping contract. "My grandmother, Clara Thorne, owns 40% of the Thorne Trading Company. I own the other 60. When she dies, her shares will go to the church unless I'm married before winter ends. That's the condition she wrote into her will 5 years ago, and she has no intention of changing it now. Why would she do that? Because she thinks I need a wife to keep me human." He said it without rancor, stating a fact. "She thinks power without family makes monsters." "Does it?" The question slipped out before Eleanor could stop it. Thorne's eyes narrowed slightly, and she braced herself for anger. Instead, he smiled. It was not a kind smile. "Sometimes." He pushed away from the desk and walked to the window. Outside, the valley stretched away toward distant peaks already dusted with early snow. "Here's what I'm offering, Miss Morrison. Marry me. 1 year of pretending to be my wife. We'll have a ceremony live under the same roof, attend social functions together. You'll play the part of a devoted spouse, and in return, I'll clear your debt, pay off the men in Copper Creek who are waiting for their money, and give you enough cash to start over anywhere you want when the year is done." Eleanor's mind raced. "You want a fake marriage? I want a marriage of convenience. No romance, no expectations beyond public appearances. Just an arrangement that gives us both what we need. And after the year, we go our separate ways, quietly. No scandal, no mess. You'll have your freedom and your money. I'll have my company intact." It sounded insane. People did not marry like this. Marriage was supposed to be about love, about building a life together, about choosing someone and being chosen in return. This was a business transaction dressed up in wedding clothes. But as she stood there in that high mountain study, watching Benjamin Thorne outline her future like a surveyor mapping property lines, Eleanor thought about the ledger in her shop. $300. Men who did not believe in second chances. Her sister Charlotte in a charity hospital in Missouri coughing blood into handkerchiefs because they could not afford the medicine she needed. She thought about her options. She could refuse and lose everything. The shop, the home above it, any chance of helping Charlotte. She could try to run and spend the rest of her life looking over her shoulder, or she could shake hands with the devil and buy herself 1 year to figure out how to survive. "I need something more than just money," she said. Thorne turned from the window, one dark eyebrow lifting. "You're in no position to negotiate. Neither are you." She kept her voice steady. "You need me as much as I need you. Maybe more. Because if you don't find a wife, you lose 40% of your company. That's got to be worth more than $300. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he walked back to the desk and sat down, gesturing for her to take the chair across from him. "What do you want?" Eleanor had spent years watching the way power worked in Copper Creek, the wealthy families who controlled the land, the mining companies that paid workers just enough to survive, the way children grew up without schools because the people who owned the timber refused to sell it at a fair price. "There's a town called Pine Ridge," she said, "about 15 miles north of Copper Creek. The children there learn their letters in a drafty barn because your company owns the best timberland and won't sell lumber at a price the town can afford. I want you to fund a proper school. Build it yourself if you have to. Just make sure those kids have a real chance." Thorne leaned back in his chair, studying her with renewed interest. "That's what you're asking for. Not jewelry, or a house, or a trust fund. I'm asking for something that matters. And you think I'm the kind of man who cares about what matters to you. I think you're the kind of man who honors his deals. If we're going to be partners, even fake ones, then I want this partnership to mean something beyond money and lies." The silence stretched between them. Outside, a hawk cried as it circled the valley. Eleanor could hear her own heartbeat loud in her ears. Then Benjamin Thorne smiled. It was a different smile this time. Still not kind, but touched with something that might have been respect. "You're either very brave or very foolish, Miss Morrison. I've been called both." He reached across the desk, extending his hand. "Do we have a deal?" Eleanor looked at his hand. Strong fingers, calloused palms, the hand of someone who had worked for what he owned. 1 year tied to this hard, dangerous man. 1 year of pretending to love someone who probably did not believe love existed. In exchange, she could save Charlotte. Clear her name. Give children she would never meet a chance at something better. It felt like shaking hands with the devil. She placed her palm in his. His grip was firm, warm, completely confident. "We have a deal," she said, "but don't expect me to act like an adoring little wife. You'll play whatever part I need you to play." His gray eyes held a spark that woke something wary inside her. "And I can be very persuasive." Eleanor pulled her hand back. "We'll see about that." 2 days later, she stood once more in Benjamin Thorne's study, feeling very small beside his massive desk. He had sent a wagon for her at dawn, along with a note written in sharp, angular handwriting. "Time to build our story. Be here by 8. She had come though every instinct told her to run. The men who had brought her were different this time, polite, almost deferential. One of them had called her Miss Morrison and helped her down from the wagon as if she were made of glass. It was unsettling. Thorne was waiting for her in the study, dressed more casually than before in a gray shirt and dark trousers. He looked like he had already been awake for hours. The desk was covered in new papers, sketches, lists written in that same sharp hand. "We need a convincing love story," he said without preamble. "The marriage is pointless if my grandmother doesn't believe it." Eleanor crossed her arms. "And what kind of story did you have in mind?" He slid a thick folder across the desk. "Open it." Inside she found sketches. Someone had drawn pictures of her and Thorne together, standing close, holding hands, looking at each other with expressions that suggested deep affection. There were copied letters, supposedly written between them over months. A timeline of their courtship complete with dates and locations. Someone had even listed what kind of pie she supposedly liked best at an imaginary picnic. Eleanor closed the folder and looked up at him. "This is disturbing. This is thorough. This is you planning a lie down to the smallest detail." Thorne walked around the desk and leaned against it, arms crossed. In the morning light his face looked harder, more tired, like someone who had not slept well. "My grandmother built trading posts and freight lines with her bare hands," he said. "She can smell a weak lie from a mile away. If we want her blessing, the story has to hold up under scrutiny. That means details. That means consistency. That means both of us knowing this story so well we could tell it in our sleep. You want me to memorize a fake romance? I want you to live it, at least in public." Eleanor picked up one of the sketches. In it she and Thorne stood beneath an aspen tree, her head tilted toward his shoulder. The artist had captured something soft in her expression, something she was not sure she had ever felt. Certainly not for the man standing in front of her. "Your grandmother is going to see right through this," she said. "Not if we're convincing." "And how exactly do we become convincing?" Thorne pushed away from the desk and moved to stand in front of her. Up close, she could see the faint lines around his eyes, the scar that cut through his eyebrow. There was a hardness to him, a sense of controlled violence barely held in check. But when he reached out and took her hands, his touch was gentle. "Like this," he said softly. His whole demeanor changed. The hard lines of his face softened. His eyes warmed. When he spoke, his voice dropped to something intimate, almost tender. "From the first moment I saw you, I knew you were different. Most people look at me and see money or power or a way to get what they want. You looked at me and saw a man. You challenged me. You made me want to be better than I am." The words rolled over her like warm water. For one strange, disorienting moment, Eleanor forgot this was practice. Her pulse stumbled. Her breath caught. There was something in the way he looked at her, something almost real in the warmth of his eyes. Then he let go of her hands and stepped back. The warmth vanished like smoke. His face went cold again, professional. The mountain trader returned. "That's what I need from you," he said briskly. "Not the truth, the performance of truth." Eleanor's hands were shaking. She clasped them together to hide it. "And what if I can't do that? Then we'll practice until you can. I told you I'm not good at acting. I dropped the baby doll in the church Christmas play when I was 12. For the first time his mouth twitched. It might have been the start of a smile. "I remember. I was in the audience." She stared at him. "You were at that play. My father dragged me, said it was good for business to support the community." He paused. "You stepped on the doll's head. Thank you for reminding me. My point is, you don't need to be a great actress. You just need to be present. Be yourself, but softer, more open, like you're letting someone past your walls." "I don't have walls." He looked at her for a long moment. "Yes, you do. We all do. Mine are just more obvious." There was something in his voice, a weariness that made him sound older than his years. Eleanor found herself wondering what it cost to be Benjamin Thorne, to be the man everyone feared and no one really knew. "Your turn," he said. Eleanor took a breath and tried. She looked at him and attempted to find something warm to say, something that would sound like love. "You're very rich," she began, "and important. People respect you, and you're not awful to look at, I suppose." She ran out of words. Thorne stared at her. Then he sighed and rubbed his temples like he had a headache. "We have a lot of work ahead of us." Annoyance sparked in her chest. "If this is such a terrible burden, maybe you should find someone else." "There is no one else. And even if there were, we have a deal. A deal I could walk away from." "Could you?" He met her eyes. "Could you really walk away knowing what happens to your sister if you do? Knowing what happens to those children in Pine Ridge?" The words hit like stones. Eleanor felt her anger drain away, replaced by something colder and heavier. He was right. She could not walk away. Not now. Maybe not ever. "This feels wrong," she said quietly. "Lying to an old woman who's never done anything to hurt me." Thorne's expression shifted. The hardness cracked just a little. "I know. Then why do it?" He turned away from her and walked to the window. For a long time he said nothing. Outside the valley lay quiet under morning sun. Smoke rose from distant cabins. A line of pack horses moved slowly along a trail headed for higher ground before the winter snows closed the passes. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. "My grandmother raised me after my father died. She sat with me through mountain fevers that should have killed me. She taught me to read both numbers and clouds. She's the only person who never walked away when things got hard." He paused. Eleanor waited. "If her last wish is to see me married," Thorne continued, "I won't hand her a cold business bargain. I'll give her a story she can believe in, a story that lets her die thinking I've found what my father had. Even if it's not real, it can still be true enough to matter." The admission hung in the air between them. Eleanor looked at his back at the set of his shoulders and saw something she had not expected. Grief held tight and controlled, but there nonetheless. She thought about her own grandmother, the Cherokee woman who had taught her about herbs and patience, who had died when Eleanor was 16. She remembered the weight of secrets, the burden of trying to protect someone you loved from the truth of how hard the world could be. "Tell me about your father," she said. Thorne glanced back at her, surprised. "Why? Because if we're going to lie about being in love, we should at least know something real about each other." He studied her for a moment. Then he nodded and gestured to the chairs by the window. They sat, and for the first time since she had met him, Benjamin Thorne let his guard down. "My father was a trapper," he said. "Nathan Thorne. He started with nothing but a mule and a rifle. Built the trading company one season at a time, one honest deal at a time. He believed in fair wages and knowing your workers by name. People trusted him. What happened to him? Avalanche. He was negotiating a contract with some timbermen up near Eagle Peak. Freak snowslide in late spring. Killed him and 3 others. Thorne's jaw tightened. "I was 12. I'm sorry. Everyone's sorry. But sorry doesn't change what happened. After he died, I swore I'd make the Thorne name so strong that no one could ever threaten it again. I built walls. I made sure everyone knew crossing me had consequences. I stopped caring about being liked and started caring about being feared." "And your grandmother? What did she think of that?" "She hated it, still hates it. She keeps telling me I'm becoming everything my father fought against, a man who values profit over people, power over principle." He fell silent. Eleanor could hear the wind moving through the pines outside. Somewhere a bird called clear and sweet. "Is she right?" Eleanor asked. Thorne looked at her. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, and in them she saw something complicated. Regret, maybe, or recognition. "Probably," he said. A knock on the door interrupted them. A clerk entered with messages from the traveling preacher. The minister needed a date for the ceremony. Thorne chose one without hesitation, 4 weeks away, marking it on a calendar with the same calm he probably used for shipping schedules. "That's not much time," Eleanor said. "It's enough. With my money and workers, it's more than enough. You can't just buy everything." "No, but I can buy most things." On their way out, Eleanor learned that Thorne had already closed her shop for repairs and arranged for her assistant to work at the general store. He had settled her debts in Copper Creek, paid her rent for 6 months, and had her belongings moved to a cabin on his property. She stopped in the hallway. "You can't just rearrange my life without asking." "I can, actually. For the next year our lives are tied together. That means I need to know where you are and what you're doing. It's not personal, Miss Morrison. It's practical." "Eleanor." He paused. "What? If we're going to be married, even fake married, you should call me Eleanor." Something shifted in his expression. "Eleanor, then. And I'll call you Benjamin. Most people call me Thorne." "I'm not most people." A hint of that almost smile flickered across his face. "No, you're not." That evening they rode up to Eagle Ridge together. The Thorne homestead sprawled across the hilltop, all carved logs and wide porches. It looked like something out of a storybook, if the storybook was about people with more money than entire towns. Eleanor wore a new dress, deep green with silver buttons. Thorne had sent it to her cabin that morning along with a note. "Wear this tonight. My grandmother notices everything." She felt like a doll being dressed for a performance. As they climbed the stone steps, Thorne's hand rested at the small of her back. It was a possessive gesture, proprietary, and it made her skin prickle. He leaned close and murmured in her ear, "She'll be watching every interaction, every touch, every word. You're not helping. I'm preparing you." A stern housekeeper opened the door and led them into a bright parlor dominated by a massive stone fireplace. 3 people rose to greet them. The first was a tall, elegant woman with Thorne's gray eyes and sharp cheekbones. The second was a broad-shouldered man with a friendly face and laugh lines around his mouth. The third was a small, elderly woman seated in a high-backed chair, and despite her size, her presence filled the room. Thorne made introductions. "Eleanor, this is my Aunt Margaret and my step-uncle Thomas, and this is my grandmother Clara Thorne." Clara held out her hand. Her fingers were thin, knotted with age, but her grip was iron. She studied Eleanor with eyes that missed nothing. "Sit beside me, child," Clara said, patting the chair next to hers. "I want to hear all about the woman who captured my grandson's attention." Eleanor sat. Up close, Clara smelled like lavender and old books. Her face was lined with decades of weather and work, but her eyes were sharp as cut glass. "Tell me about yourself," Clara said. "Where did you grow up? How did you learn about herbs? What do you love most about these mountains?" The questions came gently, but Eleanor could feel the weight behind them. This was a test. Clara was measuring her, weighing her words against some internal scale that Eleanor could not see. She answered honestly. She talked about her grandmother, about learning to identify plants in the woods behind their cabin. She talked about the way the mountains looked at sunrise, all purple shadow and golden light. She talked about the satisfaction of helping someone heal, of mixing the right combination of herbs to ease pain or bring sleep. As she spoke, Eleanor realized she was revealing more than she meant to. There was something about Clara's attention, the way the old woman listened with her whole being, that made truth come easier than lies. After a while, Clara asked the question Eleanor had been dreading. "How did you meet my grandson?" The room went quiet. Eleanor felt Thorne watching her from across the room where he stood with Thomas and Margaret. They had practiced this. They had a whole story prepared, polished and perfect. But when Eleanor opened her mouth to recite it, Clara raised one hand. "Wait," the old woman said. "That sounds too rehearsed already, and you haven't even started. I don't want the version you practiced. I want the real version, the messy one, the one that actually happened." Thorne opened his mouth. Clara silenced him with a look that could have stopped a charging bear. "I want to hear it from Eleanor," Clara said. "Not from you." Eleanor's heart hammered. She looked at Thorne. His jaw was tight. A warning flashed in his eyes. They were supposed to stick to the script. That was the whole point of the folder full of lies and letters and sketches. But Clara was too smart. She had already sensed the polish, the falseness. If Eleanor tried to sell her the prepared story now, the old woman would see right through it. So Eleanor took a breath and threw the script away. "The first time I met your grandson," she said slowly, "he tried to buy my shop building so he could tear it down and build a warehouse." Margaret's eyes went wide. Thomas made a low sound like a cough or a strangled laugh. Thorne's face went very still. Clara leaned forward slightly. "Go on?" "I said no. He offered me more money. I still said no. So he started buying up all the buildings around mine, trying to force me out. I rallied the other shopkeepers. We formed a coalition against him. And," Clara's eyes gleamed with something that might have been delight, "I called him a heartless mountain tyrant. To his face, in front of a room full of people." Thomas did laugh, then quickly muffled behind his hand. Margaret looked torn between horror and amusement. Thorne stared at Eleanor like she had just set his house on fire. Clara's smile grew wider. "What did he do?" Eleanor swallowed. "He kept coming back, again and again. I must have told him no 20 times, maybe more. He'd show up at my shop with new offers, new arguments, new ways of trying to convince me." The truth was easier than she expected, maybe because there was real truth buried in the lie. Thorne had tried to buy her building 8 months ago. She had fought him. The anger between them had been genuine, sharp-edged, and bitter. What came next was the part where she had to blend fact with fiction. "The last time he came," Eleanor continued, her voice softer now, "he didn't bring money or contracts. He brought a flower, a little mountain flower, half-dead petals torn by wind. He said he saw it by the trail and thought of me." She glanced at Thorne. He had moved to stand beside her chair. His face was unreadable, but something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, maybe, or recognition of where she was taking this. "I asked him why," Eleanor said. "Why would a dying flower make him think of me? And he said—" She paused, suddenly unsure. She had been about to make something up, but Thorne spoke first, his voice low and carrying across the room. "I said you had a gift for taking damaged things and making them strong again, for seeing worth where others saw waste. Watching you tend that flower, watching you save something everyone else would have thrown away, it changed something in me." Silence fell over the parlor. Eleanor stared up at Thorne. He looked down at her, and for a heartbeat, the performance felt real. There was something in his eyes that had nothing to do with business deals or fake marriages. Then Clara leaned back in her chair with a small, satisfied smile. "Now that," the old woman said, "sounds like the truth. Not perfect, but honest in the ways that matter." Dinner was surprisingly pleasant. Thomas told stories about Thorne as a boy, wild and reckless climbing trees no sane child would attempt. Margaret asked Eleanor about her herb work with genuine interest. Clara watched everything, saying little, but Eleanor could feel her attention like sunlight. Afterward, as the household staff cleared plates and brought coffee, Clara asked Eleanor to walk with her in the garden. Thorne started to follow, but his grandmother waved him off. "I want to talk to your bride alone, Benjamin. Surely you trust me for 10 minutes. The garden wrapped around the side of the house, full of late-season roses and herbs gone woody with age. Clara walked slowly, leaning on Eleanor's arm more than her cane. They moved between the flower beds in comfortable silence. Finally, Clara spoke. "You're afraid of me." Eleanor started to deny it, but Clara squeezed her arm. "Don't lie, child. I can feel you trembling. You think I'm going to see through your story and call you out as a fraud." Eleanor's throat went dry. "Relax," Clara said. "I'm not going to expose you." They stopped beside a bench carved from a single massive log. Clara sat with a sigh of relief. Eleanor remained standing, too shocked to move. "You know," Eleanor whispered, "that this started as some kind of bargain between you and my grandson? Of course I know. I've known Benjamin since he was born. I know when he's being genuine and when he's playing a part." Clara looked up at her with those sharp eyes. "He was playing a part when he announced the engagement. Too smooth, too perfect. Benjamin is many things, but smooth in matters of the heart is not one of them." Eleanor sank onto the bench beside her. "Then why didn't I call him on it?" Clara smiled. Because I also saw something else. I saw the way he looks at you when he thinks no one is watching. I saw the way you reach for his hand without realizing you're doing it. Whatever bargain brought you two together, something real is growing from it, something neither of you expected. You can't possibly know that. I'm 72 years old, child. I've seen love in more forms than you can imagine, and I've learned that it doesn't matter how it starts. What matters is where it goes. Clara patted her hand. So I'm going to make you two work for this. I'm going to watch and test and prod, not to break you apart, but to see if what's growing between you has real roots. Eleanor did not know what to say. Clara stood using her cane for balance. One more thing, the old woman said. I know about your sister in Missouri, about the medical bills. Eleanor's heart stopped. I also know about the school you demanded Benjamin fund in Pine Ridge. That tells me everything I need to know about your character. Clara's voice softened. My grandson is about to inherit a company worth more than most people can imagine. He needs someone who will remind him that money is just a tool, that what you build with it matters more than how much you have. I think you might be that someone. She walked away before Eleanor could respond, leaving her alone in the garden with the scent of dying roses and the weight of impossible expectations. Thorne found her there an hour later. The sun had set, and the first stars were emerging in the deep blue sky. He sat on the bench beside her without speaking. They watched the mountains fade to shadow. She knows, Eleanor said finally. I figured. He did not sound surprised. What did she say? Eleanor told him. All of it. The confession about knowing the engagement was fake. The observation about something real growing between them. Clara's decision to test them rather than expose them. When she finished, Thorne was quiet for a long time. She's gambling, he said at last. Betting that if she gives us time and pressure, we'll either fall apart or become something genuine. And which do you think will be? He turned to look at her. In the twilight his face was all angles and shadows. I don't know. A month ago I would have said we'd fall apart. But now I'm not so sure. Eleanor's breath caught. There was something in the way he looked at her, something that made her pulse quicken and her skin warm despite the evening chill. We should go, Thorne said, standing abruptly. It's a long ride back. They rode down the mountain in near darkness, the horses picking their way carefully along the trail. Neither of them spoke. The silence between them had changed. It was no longer the empty silence of strangers or the wary silence of adversaries. It was the silence of two people who had started to see each other clearly and were not sure what to do about it. When they reached Eleanor's cabin, Thorne helped her down from the wagon. His hands lingered on her waist for a moment longer than necessary. In the lamplight spilling from the windows, she could see his face clearly. The hard lines, the careful control, the crack in his armor that had not been there before. Eleanor, he said, about what happened tonight. We don't have to talk about it. I think we do. He stepped back, putting distance between them. My grandmother is dying. This wedding might be the last wish she ever sees fulfilled. We have to make it count. We have to make her believe. I know. But we also have to be careful. This is still a business arrangement. 1 year, then we part ways. That hasn't changed. Eleanor nodded, even though something in her chest ached at his words. I understand. Good. He moved toward the wagon, then stopped. Thank you for what you did tonight, for saving our story. I just told the truth, mostly. That's what made it work. He climbed into the wagon and gathered the reins. Before he drove away, he looked back at her one more time. Get some rest. We have a wedding to plan. Eleanor watched him disappear into the darkness. Then she went inside, closed the door, and leaned against it. Her hands were shaking, her heart was racing, and somewhere deep inside, in a place she had not expected, something was beginning to bloom. It felt dangerous. It felt reckless. It felt like the first shoots of something that could either save her or destroy her completely. 4 weeks, she thought. 4 weeks until the wedding. 4 weeks to figure out if she was playing a part or becoming someone new. Outside, the mountain wind whispered through the pines. Inside, Eleanor sat by the fire and stared at the flames. She thought about Clara's words about bargains that grew into something real, about love that crept in slowly and took root before you noticed. She told herself it was just an act, just a performance. 1 year of pretending, then freedom. But lies she knew from her grandmother's teachings had a way of becoming truth when you stopped watching them carefully. And Eleanor was starting to suspect that she and Benjamin Thorne had stopped watching their lie very carefully indeed. The ledger on her small table still showed the debt. $300. A school in Pine Ridge. A sister in Missouri who needed help. All the practical reasons that had brought her here. But now there was something else. Something she could not name yet. Something that made her pulse quicken when Thorne looked at her. Something that made her believe just for a moment that maybe Clara was right. Maybe what started as a cold bargain could become something warm and real. Or maybe she was just a fool. Time would tell. Winter was coming, and with it the truth that neither of them was ready to face. Eleanor just hoped she would be strong enough to face whatever the mountains revealed. 4 days after that first supper on Eagle Ridge, hard pounding on Eleanor's cabin door yanked her from sleep. She dragged on her robe and hurried across the cold floor as Dorothy Miller's sharp voice cut through the early light, high and tight with panic. When Eleanor opened the door, the famous seamstress stood there with her hat, crooked hair flying loose, and her measuring tape dangling around her neck like it had given up trying to be useful. "The church," Dorothy gasped, one hand pressed to her chest. "Lightning struck it during last night's storm. Part of the roof came down. Minister says it's not safe." Eleanor grabbed the door frame to steady herself. "Can we move the date?" Dorothy shook her head so hard her hat nearly fell off. Mr. Thorne was very clear. The wedding has to happen before the end of November, for his grandmother's sake. That gives us 19 days, and every decent hall and chapel in the region is already promised to someone else. We need to ask Benjamin. Dorothy lifted her chin, a gesture that made her look remarkably like a bird preparing for battle. "I already did. He's locked in trade meetings all morning. Sent back one short reply." She pulled a folded paper from her pocket and read it aloud. "Eleanor will know what to do." The words echoed in Eleanor's head as she dressed. The most feared trader in the mountains was trusting her judgment with his grandmother's last wish. It should have felt like pressure. Instead, it felt like something else, something that made her chest tight and her hands unsteady as she buttoned her dress. An hour later, they sat at a battered table in the Copper Creek General Store. Maps, fabric swatches, and Dorothy's busy notebook lay spread between barrels of flour and crates of nails. The store smelled like coffee and sawdust, and the particular kind of tension that came from having impossible problems and limited time. Dorothy slid a finger across the map and tapped a point higher up in the hills. "There's Thorne's old mountain property near Aspen Grove, a private meadow with a cabin that once belonged to his parents. It's been empty for years, but the land is sound." Eleanor frowned. "I've never heard him mention it." Dorothy lifted one eyebrow and said dryly, "A bride ought to know where her groom keeps his hideaways, though I suppose there hasn't been much time for that kind of conversation." She tapped the map again. "His parents used the place as a summer retreat before Nathan died. It's remote, pretty, and as far as I can tell, wide open on the schedule." They sent a rider with a note at once. Eleanor kept the message simple. "The church is damaged. Dorothy suggests Aspen Grove. Would that work for you?" The answer came back faster than she expected. Thorne's handwriting was less controlled than usual, the letters slightly uneven as if he had written quickly. "I haven't visited Aspen Grove in years. Could it really work?" Then in a second message that arrived 20 minutes later, a single additional line. "It was my parents' place before my father died." That simple admission tightened something in Eleanor's chest. She could read between the words. This place mattered to him. It held memories both precious and painful. Using it for their wedding, for their performance of love, felt like a violation of something sacred. She sent back a careful response. "We can choose another site if the memories are too difficult." His answer came firm and clear. "Aspen Grove would be perfect. My grandmother would approve. Make whatever arrangements you need. I'll send workers this afternoon." The road to Aspen Grove wound higher into the mountains through white bark aspens that shivered like nervous dancers in the wind. Eleanor and Dorothy rode in a small wagon pulled by two sturdy horses that knew the trail. The driver was an older man named Sam, who had worked for the Thorne family since Nathan's time. "Haven't been up to the Grove in near 10 years, Sam said as they climbed. "Mr. Nathan loved that place. Built it with his own hands mostly, said every man needed a piece of paradise to call his own." The higher they climbed, the more the air changed, thinner, colder, touched with the smell of pine and coming snow. Eleanor pulled her shawl tighter and watched the landscape transform. Down in the valleys, autumn still held on with brown grass and the occasional splash of late wildflowers. Up here, winter was already reaching down from the peaks, touching everything with frost and warning. When they finally rode into the clearing, Eleanor understood why this land had mattered. A log cabin sat at the edge of a wide meadow, solid and square, built to withstand mountain weather. The porch sagged a little on one side, and dust dulled the glass in the windows. A narrow creek curved along one edge of the property, flashing silver in the afternoon sun. Old flower beds lay buried under weeds and wild growth. But even neglected, even sleeping under years of disuse, the place had a quality that made Eleanor's breath catch. It felt calm, steady, like a house waiting patiently for someone to turn the lamps back on and remember what it meant to call something home. Dorothy planted her hands on her hips and surveyed the property with a critical eye. "We'll need a small army of workers to make it ready in less than 3 weeks. The porch needs shoring up. Those windows need cleaning. The grounds need clearing. And we'll have to build an arch and seating for the guests." Before Eleanor could answer, another wagon rattled into the clearing. She recognized Thomas Reed at the reins, but the passenger who stepped down, moving carefully with the help of a nurse, made Eleanor's stomach drop. Clara Thorne. The old woman leaned on her carved walking stick and let her sharp eyes sweep over the cabin and meadow. Her face, usually so controlled, softened in a way Eleanor had not seen before. Something like pain flickered across her features, or maybe it was love which sometimes looked the same. "I thought you might choose this place," Clara said, her voice quieter than usual. "When Dorothy sent word about the church, I told Thomas we should come see." She walked forward slowly, the nurse hovering close. Eleanor noticed how thin Clara had become, how the clothes that had fit properly at dinner now hung loose on her frame. The dying was happening faster than anyone wanted to admit. Clara stopped in front of the cabin and looked up at it. "My son built this for his bride. Took him 2 summers working every spare moment. He said every true love story deserved its own little piece of paradise." She turned to Eleanor. He was right. Guilt pricked deep under Eleanor's ribs. This paradise was about to host a marriage that had started as a cold transaction, a performance designed to ease an old woman's dying. Standing here, seeing the love in Clara's face as she remembered her son Eleanor, felt like she was defiling something sacred. "The property needs a great deal of work," Eleanor said carefully. "We might not have enough time to make it suitable." Clara just smiled. It was a knowing smile touched with something that might have been amusement. "Anything worth keeping needs care, child. That includes buildings. That includes land. That especially includes my grandson." Hoofbeats sounded on the trail before Eleanor could respond. She turned to see Benjamin Thorne riding into the clearing on a dark stallion that moved like liquid shadow. He was dressed differently than she had ever seen him, no fine coat or pressed vest. Just a plain work shirt and leather vest clothes meant for riding hard through mountain country. He swung down from the saddle in one smooth motion and crossed to his grandmother. The kiss he placed on her cheek was gentle, full of genuine affection. Clara reached up and patted his face the way you might touch something precious and fragile. "You left your formal armor at home," Clara teased. "I'm impressed." Thorne laughed. The sound was easy and real, and Eleanor hardly recognized him. Around his grandmother, the hard angles of his face softened. He looked less like the ruthless mountain man everyone feared, and more like the boy he must have once been, before his father died, before he learned that the world could take everything you loved in a single avalanche. When he turned to Eleanor, his gaze swept over the clearing, taking in the sagging porch and dusty windows and wild growth. "What do you think?" she told him simply. "It's beautiful, and it'll take serious effort." He nodded once. "Then let's begin." The next days turned the sleeping meadow into a busy work site. Thorne sent crews from his various operations, loggers who knew how to brace sagging structures, carpenters who could repair windows and doors, men who cleared brush and hauled lumber and straightened fences with the kind of efficient competence that came from years of hard work. Eleanor moved among them with her sleeves rolled up boots, growing dusty hair pinned up in whatever fashion kept it out of her face. She pointed out where wild growth should stay and where it needed cutting. She traced a wide path from the cabin door to the creek and marked 2 slender aspens that would frame the place where she and Thorne would stand. Her eye for herbs, for understanding how plants grew and what they needed, shifted naturally into an eye for the land itself. She knew where the afternoon sun fell soft and golden, where the ground stayed dry after rain, where wildflowers would look like they had grown there forever instead of being carefully transplanted by human hands. Before long, the workers were seeking her opinion before they moved anything. A man would call out asking if they should cut back a particular bush or leave it. Another would wonder aloud about the best place for benches. Eleanor would walk over, consider the question with the same careful attention she gave to mixing medicines, and give an answer that always seemed exactly right. She didn't realize she was leading. She only saw that the work was getting done, and the meadow was transforming from neglected to cared for, from sleeping to waking. Thorne came often. At first he arrived to check on progress, to give orders, to review supply lists with the crew foreman. He would stand with his arms crossed, asking sharp questions about timelines and materials and costs. But before long he started staying longer than necessary. He would finish his business with the foreman and then find reasons to linger, checking a fence post, examining the porch repairs, walking the perimeter of the property as if looking for problems that did not exist. What he was really doing was watching Eleanor. He noticed the way she spoke to plants as if they were stubborn children who needed gentle coaxing. He saw the streak of dirt on her cheek that she had forgotten about. He noticed the pencil stuck behind her ear while she searched her pockets for it, swearing softly. He heard her laugh with the workers, easy and genuine, and saw how they relaxed around her in a way they never did around him. Each small detail loosened something in his chest that he had not even known was clenched. Each moment of watching her move through the world with competence and kindness made it harder to remember that this was supposed to be temporary, a business arrangement with an expiration date. One evening, as the sun slid behind the peaks and the sky turned soft orange and purple, Eleanor sat on a fallen log by the creek. She had a piece of paper balanced on her knee and was sketching the outline of the wedding arch. The water moved over stones with a steady, soothing sound. The air smelled like pine and sawdust and the wild mint she had crushed under her heel earlier. Thorne walked down the slope and sat beside her without a word. For a while they just watched the water. It was one of those rare moments when silence felt comfortable instead of awkward, when being near someone required no performance and no explanation. He finally spoke, his voice lower than usual. "You've done wonders with this place. My father would have liked what you've made of it." There was honest pride in his voice. It startled Eleanor more than any threat he had ever made in his office. This was not the calculating businessman. This was someone else, someone more human and therefore more dangerous to her carefully maintained distance. "Thank you," she said. Then, because the evening light and the sound of water made truth easier, she added, "I've grown attached to Aspen Grove, more than I expected to." She pulled out the small leather purse that held the money he had already sent for the Pine Ridge School. She had been carrying it with her for days, a weight in her pocket. "I haven't spent any of this yet," she said quietly. "I wanted to see if you'd keep your promise after the wedding, when the deal no longer forced you to care." Thorne stared at the creek for a long time. His shoulders tensed. His jaw worked like he was chewing on words he did not want to speak. When he finally spoke again, his voice was rougher. My father was a trapper who built Thorn Trading from nothing. He believed in fair deals and knowing every worker by name. People came to him because they trusted him to be honest, even when honesty cost him profit. Eleanor waited. She could feel something important coming, like the pressure change before a storm. After he died, Thorn continued, I swore to make the family name so strong that no one could ever threaten it again. I built walls. I made examples of people who crossed me. I bought out competitors and crushed anyone who stood in my way. I told myself it was for the family legacy, for the company my father built. But, Eleanor prompted gently, but somewhere along the climb I started caring more about power than people, about winning than being right. I became exactly what my father never wanted me to be. He turned to look at her. A tyrant, like you called me. The admission hung between them. Eleanor could have used it as a weapon, could have pressed the advantage made him feel worse about himself. Instead, she asked the question that mattered. Why did your father work so hard in the first place? Thorn's answer came immediately, as if he had asked himself the same question many times. For family, for love. He wanted to give my mother a good life, wanted to make sure I had opportunities he never had. It was always about people, not profit. He let out a short breath that held no humor at all. It's strange. I'm staging a fake marriage to protect that legacy. A cold business bargain to honor a man who believed business should never be cold. The irony isn't lost on me. The truth in that confession settled over them like the cool evening air. Without really thinking, Eleanor reached across the rough bark of the log and set her hand over his. This time he did not pull away. His fingers curled slowly around hers. Not with the hard grip she had felt in his office that first day when he had been establishing dominance. Not with the performative gentleness he used when they practiced being in love for an audience. This was different. This was simple human need, the need to be touched, to be understood, to sit beside someone who had seen your worst self and had not walked away. They sat like that as the sun finished setting and the first stars emerged. Neither of them spoke. Words would have broken something fragile that was growing between them, something that had no name yet, but felt more real than any contract they had signed. From the cabin porch, Clara nodded to her nurse. She had seen enough. By the end of the second week, Aspen Grove looked new again. Lantern posts lined a wide, grassy aisle that led from the cabin to the creek. Rough benches stood in neat rows made from logs and smoothed planks. Clean white curtains fluttered in the cabin windows. Wildflowers bloomed along every path, positioned so carefully that they looked like they had grown there naturally instead of being transplanted under Eleanor's watchful eye. The transformation was remarkable. What had been sleeping and neglected now looked like something out of a dream, a place where promises could be made and kept, where two people could stand before witnesses and vow to love each other forever, even if those promises were lies. On the last evening before the rehearsal supper, Eleanor stood alone on the upper porch and looked out over everything they had made. Laughter rose from the meadow where workers were finishing the final tasks. Below, Thorn walked the lantern line with Thomas, checking each hook and knot with the thoroughness that defined everything he did. Somewhere between that first sight of a sagging porch and this soft mountain sunset, Aspen Grove had become more than a stage in Eleanor's mind, more than a convenient location for their performance. It had become something else, something that felt dangerously close to home. She reminded herself of the facts. The marriage was still a one-year bargain. When it ended, she would leave with her debt cleared and the school funded. She would start over somewhere far from these mountains. She would forget Benjamin Thorn and his gray eyes and the way he looked at her when he thought no one was watching. But even as she told herself these things, she knew they were becoming harder to believe. Because when she watched Thorn down in the lantern glow, laughing at something Thomas said easy and unguarded in a way he never was in town, she felt something slow and warm building behind her ribs. It felt like falling. And Eleanor understood with sudden terrible clarity that the most dangerous thing in Colorado was no longer the mountains or the men who had once held her debt. The real danger now lived inside her own changing heart, a heart that was steadily, stubbornly beginning to fall for the most arrogant mountain man she had ever met. The night of the rehearsal dinner, Aspen Grove glowed with lanterns and voices. Long tables filled the meadow covered with white cloth and laden with food. Music drifted from the cabin where someone was playing a fiddle. The whole place looked ready for a real wedding, for real love, for promises that would last longer than a single year. Eleanor watched from the upper gallery of the cabin, fingers tight on the railing. The paths and benches and flowers below had all grown from her sketches and decisions. She had built this, shaped it, made it real, and somewhere along the way it had started to feel like hers, like something she had a right to claim. That frightened her more than she wanted to admit. A knock sounded on the door. She called for the visitor to enter, expecting Dorothy with some last-minute crisis about seating arrangements or table settings. Instead, Margaret Thorne stepped inside. She wore dark blue silk and moved with the kind of easy elegance that came from a lifetime of confidence. Her gray eyes, so like her nephew's, studied Eleanor with an expression that was hard to read. "You look lovely," Margaret said after a moment. "Thank you." Eleanor gestured to the dress Dorothy had made for her, deep burgundy with black lace. "Your seamstress is a miracle worker. Dorothy has been dressing this family for 30 years. She knows what she's doing." Margaret moved to stand beside Eleanor at the railing. Together they watched the crowd gathering below. "My nephew has changed since you arrived." Eleanor's hands tightened on the rail. "Has he? He smiles more. He listens more. Just last week he canceled the timber contract in Pine Ridge." Margaret turned to look at Eleanor directly. "The very contract you once fought him on. He said it wasn't right to profit from harm when there were other ways to do business." Eleanor stared at her, genuinely shocked. "He didn't tell me." "Benjamin rarely tells anyone when he's trying to be better. He's afraid of being seen as weak." Margaret's voice softened. "But he looks at you the way his father once looked at his mother. Like you're the only real thing in a world full of shadows and lies." The words landed deep and heavy. Eleanor wanted to protest, to explain that it was all an act, a performance, a marriage of convenience that would end in 1 year with both of them walking away unharmed. But the words would not come, because she was not sure they were true anymore. Margaret reached into her pocket and pulled out a small velvet pouch. "Clara wanted you to have these. They belonged to Benjamin's mother. She wore them at her wedding." Inside the pouch were a pair of simple silver earrings, each set with a small blue stone. Nothing elaborate or expensive, but beautiful in their simplicity. The kind of thing you would wear if you were marrying for love instead of contracts. "I can't accept these," Eleanor said. "You already have." Margaret pressed the pouch into her hand. "Clara chose you, Eleanor, not because of your shop or your herbs or any practical reason. She chose you because she sees something in you that might save her grandson from becoming the monster he's been building himself into." Before Eleanor could respond, Margaret left, closing the door softly behind her. Eleanor stood alone in the room, holding the earrings. She moved to the small mirror on the wall and fastened them slowly. When she fastened the earrings and looked at her reflection, she hardly recognized herself. Then she squared her shoulders and went to face whatever came next. Then she squared her shoulders and went to face whatever came next. When she stepped onto the porch, a few minutes later, the conversations in the meadow dipped. People turned to look. Someone whistled softly. The fiddle music swelled. Thorne broke away from a group of traders and came to meet her at the bottom of the steps. He stopped 1 step down, which put them almost at eye level. His gaze went straight to the earrings. Something flickered in his expression, recognition, memory, and something else that looked almost like pain. "Those were my mother's," he said quietly. "Your aunt said your grandmother wanted me to have them." "They suit you." His voice was rough. "She would have liked that. My mother, she would have liked you." There was no cold edge in his voice, no calculation, just honest emotion, raw and unguarded. Eleanor felt something crack in her carefully maintained defenses. Thorne offered his arm. She took it. Together they walked down into the meadow, into the warm glow of lanterns and the sound of music and laughter, into a celebration of a marriage that had started as a lie but was slowly, dangerously becoming something neither of them could control. The meal passed in a blur. Food appeared and disappeared. Wine flowed freely. Thomas told tales about young Benjamin running wild through the mountains, climbing trees that should have killed him, swimming in creeks so cold they turned lips blue. The stories painted a picture of a boy who had been fearless once, before loss taught him to be afraid. Margaret kept conversation light and easy, steering talk away from anything too personal or probing. Clara watched everything from her chair at the main table. She ate little but smiled often, her sharp eyes missing nothing. Then Thomas rose to give the first toast. He was slightly drunk, cheerful and loud, and his words came with the easy affection of family. "To stubborn Thorn men," he declared, raising his glass, "and the strong women who choose to stand beside them. May you argue often enough to keep things interesting, and make up thoroughly enough to make the arguing worthwhile." Laughter rolled across the tables. People drank. Someone called out for another toast. Margaret followed with something more refined, speaking about new beginnings and the way two people could make each other better simply by choosing to see the best in one another. Then a tall woman in a burgundy dress stood. Eleanor had not noticed her before, tucked away at a table near the back. But as soon as the woman rose, Eleanor felt the temperature in the meadow drop. The woman's gaze slid over Thorn with something that might have been regret or anger or both. Then it fixed on Eleanor with cold assessment. "I'd like to say a few words about the groom," the woman said. Her voice was cultured, educated, sharp as cut glass. Clara set down her wine glass with a sound like a gunshot. "Victoria, that's enough." So this was Victoria Hayes, the ex-fiancée Dorothy had warned about, the woman who had left Thorn at the altar 5 years ago. Eleanor had imagined her as older, harder, someone obviously cruel. Instead, Victoria was beautiful and poised, the kind of woman who would photograph well and make other women feel inadequate just by existing. Victoria smiled. It did not reach her eyes. "I'm just sharing my memories, Clara." "Surely that's allowed at a celebration." She turned her attention back to Eleanor. "I knew Benjamin Thorn for 3 years. We were engaged to be married. In that time I learned that he was a man who claimed he could not commit to anyone or anything that might slow his rise to power." The meadow had gone very quiet. Even the fiddle player had stopped, sensing the shift in atmosphere. People watched with the kind of fascinated horror that came from witnessing a train derailment. Victoria continued, her voice sweet as poisoned honey. "So I'm curious, Miss Morrison. What makes you so special that he changed so quickly? What makes you different from all the other women he's dismissed and discarded?" Thorn began to rise from his chair. His face had gone hard, dangerous. Eleanor recognized that look. It was the face of the mountain trader who crushed opponents and made examples of people who crossed him. Before he could speak, Eleanor laid a hand on his arm. She felt the tension in his muscles, the barely controlled anger. She squeezed gently and stood. Her heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat. Every instinct screamed at her to sit down, to let Thorn handle this, to not make herself a target. But Clara had warned her that this marriage would be tested. This was the test. Right here, right now, in front of everyone who mattered. Eleanor looked at Victoria and found her voice. "Thank you for sharing your perspective," she said. Her voice was steadier than she felt. "I appreciate knowing what Benjamin was like before we met." She paused. The meadow waited. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. "You're right that there's nothing special about me," Eleanor continued. "I'm just a woman who runs a small herb shop in a dusty mining town. Nothing glamorous, nothing impressive. But I'm also the woman who was stubborn enough to tell Benjamin Thorn no when he tried to flatten my street for a warehouse." Soft laughter rippled through the crowd. Eleanor felt the tension ease slightly. "The man I know," she went on, speaking clearly so everyone could hear, "spends quiet mornings in his grandmother's herb beds pulling weeds and listening to her stories. He canceled a rich timber contract because it would have destroyed a forest grove that meant everything to families with almost nothing else. He sits with injured workers in their homes and makes sure their families have what they need, not because it's good business, but because it's right. She looked directly at Victoria. I don't know the man you knew 5 years ago. Maybe he was cold and calculating. Maybe he was incapable of love. But people change. Sometimes they change because they've been hurt. Sometimes they change because someone finally showed them a different way to be. Eleanor raised her glass. To Benjamin Thorne, not the legend everyone fears, not the mountain man built of ice and stone. To the real man underneath all that armor, the one worth knowing, the one worth loving. For a moment, the meadow stayed perfectly still. Eleanor stood there with her glass raised, heart hammering, wondering if she had just made everything worse. Then applause broke out. It started with Thomas, loud and enthusiastic. Margaret joined in. Soon the whole meadow was clapping and people were calling out agreement and raising their own glasses. Victoria sat down slowly. The triumphant expression had drained from her face, replaced by something more complicated. She looked at Thorne, then at Eleanor, then down at her wine glass. When Eleanor returned to her seat, Thorne leaned close. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Did you mean every word?" She looked at him. At the man who had threatened her with debt and offered her a bargain she could not refuse. At the man who had slowly revealed himself to be more complicated and more human than she had ever expected. "I did," she said. Something shifted in his eyes. Something that looked like hope, which was far more dangerous than anger or calculation had ever been. Clara rose slowly from her chair. The crowd fell silent immediately. When the matriarch of the Thorne family chose to speak, people listened. Clara's voice was thinner than it had been at their first dinner. Age and illness were taking their toll, but her words carried across the meadow with perfect clarity. When I first heard my grandson was marrying, she said, I doubted it. I've watched Benjamin build walls around his heart since his father died, watched him choose power over people, profit over kindness. I thought he'd forgotten how to let anyone close. She paused, looking at Thorne with an expression full of complicated love. But then I met Eleanor. I watched how she looks at him, not at his wealth or his power or his name. She looks at the man underneath. And I've seen how he looks at her when he thinks no one is watching, like she's water and he's been walking through desert for years. Clara raised her glass with a hand that trembled slightly. Real love doesn't always announce itself with trumpets and lightning. Sometimes it creeps in slowly, takes root before you even notice, grows deeper than you planned. She looked directly at Eleanor and Thorne. May your love grow deeper roots than either of you ever imagined. May it sustain you through storms and drought. May it be the best surprise of your lives. She drank. Everyone drank. And Eleanor felt the weight of those words settle over her like a prophecy or a curse. Maybe both. Later, after the last toasts had been made and guests began to drift away, Eleanor slipped along the path to the wild rose hedge. The creek murmured somewhere in the darkness. The mountain air cooled her flushed cheeks and cleared her head. Footsteps crunched on gravel. Thorne joined her, his coat unbuttoned and his tie loosened. For a moment they stood side by side in comfortable silence, watching stars emerge in the deep blue sky. "Did you know about the Pine Ridge contract?" Eleanor asked. "That I'd find out tonight." "No. Margaret told you." "Yes." Thorne was quiet for a moment. "I canceled it because it no longer felt right. Meeting you made me look at things differently. Made me see more than just numbers and profit margins." The words came out rough and honest. This was not a performance. This was truth offered without calculation or agenda. "The man who made that choice," Eleanor said softly, "is not the same man I first met in your office. Something kinder lives in him now." Thorne gave a short, uneasy laugh. "My priorities are no longer what they used to be." The air between them shifted, became charged with something Eleanor could not name. Thorne reached up and brushed a loose strand of hair away from her face, tucking it carefully behind her ear where the silver earring caught moonlight. His fingers lingered against her skin. His touch was gentle, almost reverent. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "This isn't how our tidy bargain was supposed to go. I never planned on falling for you." Eleanor's breath caught. The answer forming in her throat felt too large, too dangerous to speak aloud. Because if she said it, if she admitted what was happening to her, then there would be no going back. The lie would become truth. The performance would become reality. And she was not sure she was ready for that. Before she could respond, Dorothy's voice cut across the garden, sharp and urgent. "Eleanor, Benjamin, I need you both right now." The moment shattered like dropped glass. Dorothy hurried toward them with her notebook clutched to her chest, talking fast about two feuding families and a seating chart that would cause a war if it was not fixed before morning. By the time they turned back toward the cabin, the pull between Eleanor and Thorne had settled into something deeper and quieter, an ache that lived just below the surface, a question that had been asked but not answered. On the back steps of the cabin, Thorne slowed and asked again, almost under his breath, "Did you truly mean what you said in your toast?" Eleanor looked up at him. The lantern light caught the planes of his face, throwing shadows that made him look both harder and more vulnerable than usual. "I did," she said simply. Neither of them saw Clara watching from her upstairs window, a shawl over her shoulders and a small knowing smile on her face. The old woman turned from the glass and called for Thomas. "Send for the family lawyer at first light," she said. Her voice was tired but satisfied. "There are going to be changes to the way Thorne power and property pass hands, changes that will protect what I've seen growing here tonight." Thomas looked worried. "Clara, maybe you should wait. Rest first." "I'm dying, Thomas. I don't have time to rest." But her voice was gentle. "I know what I'm doing. Trust me." Out in the dark garden under the thin mountain moon, Eleanor and Thorne stood close enough to touch, but not quite touching. The marriage of convenience that had begun in cold necessity was already growing into something far more dangerous and far more precious than either of them had ever imagined. The mountains watched patient and knowing. They had seen this story before. Two people trying to control something that could not be controlled. Two hearts building walls that were already starting to crumble. Winter was coming. Snow would fall soon, closing the passes and trapping everyone in the valleys until spring. And by the time the snow melted, Eleanor and Benjamin Thorne would either have destroyed each other or become something new. The mountains did not judge. They simply waited to see which truth would emerge when the performance finally ended and only reality remained. Wedding morning broke sharp and bright over Aspen Grove. Eleanor woke to sunlight streaming through the cabin windows and the sound of the creek running silver over stones. For a moment she lay still, watching dust motes dance in the golden light, and tried to remember who she had been before all of this began. That woman seemed impossibly far away now. The tired herbalist drowning in debt. The woman who had sat in her shop counting wintergreen and wondering how she would survive the next month. That Eleanor had been small and scared and alone. This Eleanor was something different, something she could not quite name yet. She rose and dressed in a simple cotton dress, then moved to the window. The meadow below was already busy with last-minute preparations. Workers hung garlands. Dorothy directed traffic like a general commanding troops. Thomas checked the seating arrangements one final time, and somewhere out there, Benjamin Thorne was preparing to marry her. A knock came at the door, gentle and expected. Eleanor called for the visitor to enter. Clara Thorne stepped inside, moving slowly with the help of her nurse and a carved walking stick. She carried a cedar chest, old and worn smooth by decades of handling. The nurse helped her set it on the bed, then stepped back to give them privacy. Clara looked at Eleanor for a long moment. Her eyes, still sharp despite the illness ravaging her body, seemed to see straight through to Eleanor's bones. "Nervous?" Clara asked. "Terrified," Eleanor admitted. "Good. Only fools go into marriage without fear. It means you understand what's at stake." Clara opened the cedar chest. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper that crackled with age, lay a wedding dress. It was antique lace, pale as cream, with tiny beadwork that caught the morning light. The style was old-fashioned but timeless, beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with current fashion and everything to do with care and craftsmanship and love. "This was my daughter-in-law's dress," Clara said softly. Nathan's wife, Benjamin's mother. She wore it when she married into this family 35 years ago. She lifted the dress carefully, letting the lace cascade like water. I hoped you might try it. Eleanor's throat tightened. Clara, I can't. This is too precious. It's just cloth and thread, child. It means nothing hanging in a chest. It only matters when someone wears it, when it becomes part of a new story. Clara's voice was firm. Try it on. For me. The dress fit as if it had been made for Eleanor's body. The lace settled over her shoulders like a blessing. The beadwork caught light and threw it back in soft sparks. When Eleanor looked in the mirror, she saw a woman she barely recognized. She looked like a bride, not a woman playing a part, not someone trapped in a business arrangement. She looked like someone about to make promises that would last a lifetime. You're beautiful, Clara said from her chair, just as beautiful as my Sarah was on her wedding day. Eleanor turned to face her. Did you love her, Benjamin's mother? Like my own daughter. She made Nathan happier than I ever thought possible, made him laugh every single day, made him believe the world was better than it actually was. Clara's eyes grew distant with memory. When she died giving birth to Benjamin, something broke in Nathan. He kept going, kept building the business, kept being a good father. But the joy went out of him. He worked himself to death trying to fill the hole she left behind. Is that why you wanted Benjamin to marry? To avoid that same fate? Clara smiled. It was a sad smile touched with too much knowledge. I wanted him to marry because I've seen what happens to thorn men when they're alone. They become hard. They forget how to be human. I wanted him to have someone who would remind him why any of this matters. She reached out and took Eleanor's hand. Her grip was weak but insistent. I need to tell you something, Clara said. And I need you to listen carefully. Eleanor sat on the bed beside her. I'm listening. I've known from the first family supper that this marriage began as a bargain. The words hit Eleanor like cold water. She started to speak, to deny or explain, but Clara squeezed her hand. Don't lie to me, child. I'm too old and too sick for lies. The story you told was too polished, too perfect. Benjamin is many things, but smooth in matters of the heart is not one of them. I knew immediately that something was arranged. Eleanor felt her world tilting. Then why didn't you say anything? Why didn't you expose us? Because I also saw something else. I saw the way Benjamin softened when you spoke, the way you reached for his hand without realizing you were doing it. I saw two people who had made a cold bargain but were slowly discovering something warm underneath. Clara leaned back against the pillows the nurse had arranged. Her breathing was labored, each word costing her more than it should. What began in desperation had grown roots, Clara continued. Real roots. So I chose not to expose it. I chose to give those roots time to dig deeper, to become strong enough to weather whatever storms come. Tears burned in Eleanor's eyes. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry we lied to you. Don't be sorry. Be grateful. You were given a gift most people never receive, a chance to build something real from something false, a chance to choose love instead of having it choose you. Clara smiled. Besides, I've had more fun watching you two dance around your feelings than I've had in years. An old woman needs her entertainment. Eleanor laughed through her tears. Then she leaned forward and hugged Clara gently, careful of her frail body. Thank you, Eleanor whispered, for believing in us even when we didn't believe in ourselves. That's what family does, child. That's what family is for. Margaret entered a few minutes later, then stopped in the doorway. Her hand went to her mouth when she saw Eleanor in the wedding dress. Oh, Margaret breathed. Oh, Eleanor, you look just like Sarah. She circled Eleanor slowly, tears shining in her eyes. Nathan would have approved. He would have loved you. Before Eleanor could respond, a firm knock sounded at the door. Benjamin's voice came through tight with controlled tension. Eleanor, I need to talk to you. Clara and Margaret exchanged glances. Clara nodded slightly. Margaret helped her stand, and together they moved toward the door. We'll give you privacy, Clara said. But Eleanor, stay behind the screen. Bad luck for the groom to see the bride before the ceremony. They left, closing the door softly behind them. Eleanor moved behind the decorative screen in the corner and changed back into her simple dress. Her heart hammered against her ribs. "You can come in," she called. Thorne entered. He looked like he had not slept. His shirt was wrinkled, his hair disheveled. There was a wildness in his eyes that she had never seen before. Not anger, something closer to panic. "What's wrong?" Eleanor asked from behind the screen. Thorne crossed to the window and stared out at the meadow. When he spoke, his voice was flat, carefully controlled in the way of someone barely holding themselves together. "The territorial judge arrived at dawn, unannounced. My grandmother had already arranged for him to come." Eleanor's stomach dropped. "Why?" "She signed papers this morning, transferred her 40% of Thorne Trading directly to me. No conditions, no requirements." He turned to face the screen, though he could not see her. "The company is mine now. On paper, our contract is complete. The marriage is no longer required." Silence pressed between them. Outside, someone laughed. A horse whinnied. The normal sounds of a wedding day continued, oblivious to the bomb that had just detonated. "I see," Eleanor said finally. Her voice sounded distant to her own ears. "If the deal is done," Thorne continued, each word seeming to cost him, "then so is our one-year arrangement. You're free. I'll still fund the school like I promised, but you don't have to go through with a wedding that started as a lie." Eleanor stood very still behind the screen. She could see his shadow on the floor unmoving, could hear his breathing quick and shallow. "Is that what you want?" she asked. "A clean break. Separate lives." "What I want doesn't matter. You entered this bargain under duress, under threat. Now you have a choice. A real choice. And I won't take that from you." Eleanor closed her eyes. She thought about the woman she had been when this started, desperate and trapped and alone. She thought about the bargain she had made, shaking hands with the devil to save herself and her sister and children she would never meet. She thought about Aspen Grove and Creekside conversations and the way Benjamin Thorne looked at her when he thought no one was watching. She thought about Clara's words, a chance to build something real from something false. "What if I told you," Eleanor said slowly, "that somewhere between your office and this moment I fell in love with you?" She heard his sharp intake of breath. "What if I told you," she continued, stepping out from behind the screen so he could see her, "that I don't want a clean break, that I don't want separate lives. If I walk down that aisle today, I want it to be for real, not for 1 year, for a lifetime." Thorne stared at her. In the morning light she could see everything in his face, the fear, the hope, the desperate need warring with a lifetime of protecting himself from exactly this kind of vulnerability. "Eleanor," he said, and her name on his lips sounded like a prayer. "I'm not good at this. I don't know how to be what you need. I don't need you to be good at it. I just need you to be honest." She took a step toward him. "So I'm asking you directly. Do you want to marry me? Not because of your grandmother or the company or any bargain, but because you choose to, because you want to build something real." For a long moment he did not answer. Eleanor watched him struggle, saw the war happening behind his eyes, the part of him that had learned to never let anyone close fighting against the part that was so tired of being alone. Finally he crossed to her, took her hands in his, looked at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I stopped pretending weeks ago," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "These weeks at Aspen Grove have been the most honest of my life. I think of you when I wake. I search for you in every room. I see you in every path and garden we built together." His grip tightened on her hands. "Letting you walk away now would be the worst mistake I could make," Thorne continued, "but I need you to understand what you're choosing. I'm not easy. I'm not soft. I've done things I'm not proud of, hurt people who didn't deserve it, built an empire on fear because I thought that's what strength looked like." "I know who you are," Eleanor said. "I've seen your worst self, and I'm choosing you anyway." "Why?" "Because I've also seen the man who tends his grandmother's herb garden, who sits with injured workers and remembers their children's names, who canceled a profitable contract because it was the right thing to do. She reached up and touched his face, feeling the rough stubble on his jaw. I've seen the man you're becoming, and I want to walk beside him, through all of it, the good and the hard and everything in between. Something broke in Thorne's expression, the last wall crumbling. He pulled her close and held her like she was the only solid thing in a world that was constantly shifting. Will you still meet me at the altar? He asked against her hair. As my true wife, not part of a scheme. Yes, Eleanor said simply. But Benjamin, if we do this, we do it right. Real vows, real promises, no more walls between us. He pulled back to look at her. No more walls, he agreed. I promise. They stood like that for a moment, holding each other in the morning light. Then Eleanor smiled. Now get out of here before you see me in my wedding dress. Some traditions are worth keeping. He kissed her forehead, gentle and reverent. Then he left, closing the door softly behind him. Eleanor stood alone in the room, hands shaking, heart racing. She had just chosen something impossible, something terrifying. She had chosen to trust a man who had started as her enemy, to build a life with someone who had once threatened everything she cared about. But when she looked at herself in the mirror, she did not see fear in her own eyes. She saw hope. That afternoon, the meadow filled with guests and music and the scent of pine. Eleanor stood at the top of the cabin steps in the antique lace dress and silver earrings. Her hands were steady. Her heart was full. Thomas Reed waited at the bottom of the steps, offering his arm with a gentle smile. No Thorne bride walks alone while I draw breath, he said. It would be my honor to escort you. Eleanor took his arm. Together they walked down the grass path toward where Thorne waited by the creek. Wild flowers brushed her skirts with each step. The peaks rose around them in a ring of stone and snow. The creek sang its endless song. At the far end, Thorne stood waiting. He wore a dark suit that made him look almost civilized, but Eleanor could see the wildness underneath. The mountain man who had built an empire and was now standing here vulnerable and unguarded, choosing love over power. His eyes never left her face. When Thomas placed her hand in Thorne's, she felt the slight tremor in his grip. Not fear, something deeper. The recognition that this moment mattered, that the promises they were about to make would change everything. The minister, an old man who had known Nathan Thorne and had traveled 3 days to perform this ceremony, smiled at them both. Benjamin, Eleanor, you stand before witnesses to pledge yourselves to one another. I'm told you've prepared your own vows. Thorne nodded. He kept holding Eleanor's hands as if afraid she might vanish if he let go. I'm going to set aside the words we practiced, he said. They were good words, careful words, but they weren't true. He took a breath and continued, his voice carrying across the quiet meadow. Eleanor Morrison, when I first saw you, I saw a problem to be solved. A piece in a business transaction, someone I could use to get what I needed. Several people in the audience shifted uncomfortably. This was not how wedding vows typically began. But then I learned who you really are, Thorne went on. You're the woman who rallied an entire street to stand against me, who demanded I fund a school for children I'd never meet, who looked at Aspen Grove and saw not what it was but what it could become. His voice grew rougher, more raw. You made me look at myself and see what I had become. A man my father wouldn't recognize. Someone so focused on building walls that I forgot why those walls existed in the first place. You reminded me that power means nothing without purpose, that wealth means nothing if you can't sleep at night. He paused, gathering himself. So I promise you this. I will choose what's right over what's easy, even when it costs me. I will listen when you speak, even when I don't want to hear it. I will love you with fierce loyalty through storms and drought, through success and failure. I will be the man my father hoped I would become. And I will spend every day earning the trust you've placed in me. Eleanor's vision blurred with tears. She had not expected this level of honesty, this depth of vulnerability from a man who had built his entire reputation on being unbreakable. Now it was her turn. Benjamin Thorne, she began, and had to stop to steady her voice. When I first met you, I saw a tyrant, a man with a heart of ice and a soul made of ledgers, someone who cared more about profit than people, more about winning than being right. She smiled through her tears. I was partly right and mostly wrong. Yes, you were those things, but you were also more. You were a man so afraid of being hurt again that you hurt everyone else first. A man who confused strength with cruelty because no one had shown you another way. Her hands tightened on his. I watched you kneel in your grandmother's herb garden, pulling weeds with gentle hands. Watched you cancel a contract that would have made you rich because it would have hurt people with nothing. Watched you sit beside injured workers and remember their children's names. And I realized that the tyrant was just armor. Underneath was someone worth knowing, worth loving. Her voice grew stronger. So I promise you this. I will see the real man behind the legend always. I will speak up when you lose your way, even when it's hard. I will walk beside you through every storm, not behind you or ahead of you, but with you. I will remind you why we're building all of this. And I will love you not despite your flaws, but with full knowledge of them, because you're not perfect, but you're real. And real is worth more than perfect ever could be. The minister smiled. I don't think I've ever heard vows quite like those. Honest to the point of pain. But that's the kind of honesty that builds marriages that last. He raised his hands. By the power vested in me by the territory of Colorado, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Benjamin, you may kiss your bride. Thorne pulled Eleanor close. The kiss was not gentle or tentative. It was fierce and claiming and full of promise. It tasted like mountain air and new beginnings and the terrifying beauty of choosing to trust someone completely. When they finally broke apart, the meadow erupted in applause. But Eleanor barely heard it. She was too busy looking at her husband, seeing the joy and fear and desperate hope in his eyes, seeing herself reflected back equally vulnerable, equally committed. They had started as enemies and become allies and were now something more. Something that had no name but felt strong enough to weather whatever came next. The reception was a blur of laughter and dancing and toasts. Clara sat at the main table, smiling more than Eleanor had ever seen her smile. She ate little but radiated satisfaction as if she had just completed the most important work of her life. As the sun began to set and guests started to depart, Clara called Eleanor and Thorne to her side. I have a wedding gift for you, she said. Her voice was thin, each word an effort. The deed to Aspen Grove. It's yours now. Build your life here. Make it what Nathan and Sarah never got the chance to make it. Thorne knelt beside her chair. Grandmother, you don't have to do this. I absolutely do. What else am I going to do with it? I'm dying, Benjamin. Let me give gifts while I still can. She touched his face with a trembling hand. Make me proud. Make your father proud. Build something that matters. I will, Thorne promised, his voice thick. We will. Clara looked at Eleanor. Take care of him, child. He needs you more than he'll ever admit. I know, Eleanor said, and he'll take care of me. We'll take care of each other. That's all anyone can ask. Clara leaned back exhausted. Now go. Enjoy your wedding night. Leave an old woman to her rest. They left her there, surrounded by family, and walked together toward the cabin that was now theirs. The mountains darkened. Stars emerged. The creek sang its endless song. For one perfect evening, everything felt right. But the mountains knew what Eleanor and Thorne did not yet know. That perfect moments never lasted. That every marriage, every love would be tested. That choosing to trust was just the beginning, not the end. The real work was still to come. 1 week after the wedding, while Eleanor and Thorne were visiting a ranch property in Wyoming that Thorne had inherited from his father, a rider arrived with urgent news. His horse was lathered, his face grim. Mr. Thorne, there's been an accident at Silver Creek. The Silver Creek Trading Post was one of Thorne's newest operations, built 6 months ago to serve miners and trappers in the Northern Territories. It was supposed to represent the new direction of Thorne trading. Fair wages, safe conditions, a business that lifted people up instead of grinding them down. What kind of accident? Thorne demanded. Part of the building collapsed during a routine inspection. 6 workers injured. 2 are critical. The writer's voice was rough. James Crawford, the supervisor, used cheap materials, cut costs. The structure wasn't sound. When the inspector put weight on the upper floor, it gave way. Where's Crawford now? Gone. Disappeared. Took what money he could and ran before anyone realized what he'd done. Thorne's face went hard, the mountain man returning cold and calculating. Get fresh horses. We ride for Silver Creek immediately. The journey back to Colorado took 3 days of hard riding. When they finally reached Thorne Trading's main office in Copper Creek, the situation was even worse than they had feared. The office swirled with fear and blame. Partners argued in tight, angry voices. Some demanded that Thorne step aside as CEO to calm the public. Others wanted to bury the story, pay off the injured workers quietly, and move on. Newspapers had already picked up the story. The headlines were brutal. Thorne profits over lives. New trading post built on lies and cheap materials. Is Benjamin Thorne any different from the robber barons he claims to despise? Eleanor stood beside Thorne in his office, watching him read the reports, watching the weight of it settle on his shoulders. She could see him struggling, could see the old version of himself rising up, the one that believed the only way to survive was to be harder and colder than everyone else. Maybe they're right, Thorne said finally, his voice hollow. Maybe I should step aside. Let someone else run the company, someone who hasn't failed this badly. Is that what you think your father would have done? He turned to look at her. My father never failed like this. Your father never had to reform an entire company built on exploitation and fear. He started fresh. You're trying to change something rotten from the inside. That's harder. That takes more courage. Eleanor moved to stand in front of him, made him look at her. The man I married doesn't run from hard things, she said firmly. If you truly want to honor Nathan Thorne's dream, you can't hand control to men who still think the old way. You have the chance to turn Thorne Trading into something better. A company that lifts towns instead of draining them. But only if you stay and fight for it. What if I can't fix this? What if I've destroyed everything? Then you'll have tried, and trying matters more than you think. She took his hands. I'm with you. Whatever you decide. But I believe in the man who stood at that altar and promised to choose what's right over what's easy. So choose. Right now. What's right. Thorne stared at her. Something shifted in his eyes. The fear didn't disappear, but it was joined by something else. Determination. Purpose. We face this head on, he said. No hiding, no excuses. We take responsibility and we fix it. Properly. Good, Eleanor said. Then let's get to work. That night, the community meeting hall was packed. Workers from the collapsed trading post, their families, partners in Thorne Trading, newspaper reporters, citizens who had heard the stories and wanted answers. The air was thick with anger and fear and the particular kind of tension that came right before violence. Eleanor sat in the front row, visible to everyone, a statement that she stood with her husband through this crisis. Thorne took the stage alone. No lawyers, no prepared statements, just him and the truth. My name is Benjamin Thorne, he began, and I'm here to take responsibility for what happened at Silver Creek. The crowd muttered. Someone shouted an insult. Thorne waited for quiet before continuing. 6 men were injured because I trusted the wrong person to oversee construction, because I didn't verify that my orders about materials and safety were being followed, because I was so focused on expanding quickly that I failed to ensure quality. That failure is mine, no one else's. He paused, looking out at the sea of angry faces. I know what many of you think of me, that I'm no different from any other wealthy man who cares more about profit than people. And for most of my life you would have been right. I built Thorne Trading on fear and intimidation. I valued winning over being fair. I became exactly what my father never wanted me to be. His voice grew stronger. But I'm trying to change, trying to build a different kind of company, one that actually honors the values my father believed in. That's why I'm here tonight, to make you a promise. Not a vague promise, a specific one. He pulled out papers and began reading details. Full medical care for every injured worker paid by Thorn Trading. Full wages during recovery plus bonuses. The Silver Creek post would be torn down and rebuilt properly with materials that met or exceeded every safety standard. No cost cutting, no shortcuts. But that's not enough, Thorn continued, because this shouldn't have happened in the first place. So I'm creating the Thorn Charitable Trust, starting with $100,000 of my personal wealth. This trust will fund 3 things across the territory. He listed them clearly. Schools in underserved communities, starting with Pine Ridge, fair housing that workers could actually afford, independent building inspections to ensure safe working conditions. Profit will serve people, Thorn said. Not the other way around. That's the promise. And if I break it, if I fall back into the old ways, then I don't deserve to carry my father's name. The hall was silent. People looked at each other uncertain. Some were still angry. Some were skeptical. But some were listening. Really listening. A woman stood in the back. Eleanor recognized her as the wife of one of the injured workers. "My husband has 3 broken ribs and a shattered leg," she said, her voice shaking. "He won't be able to work for months. How do I know you'll actually help us? How do I know this isn't just words?" "You don't," Thorn said honestly. "You have to take a risk on me the same way I'm asking my workers to take a risk every day. All I can offer is this. Come to my office tomorrow. I'll show you the medical contracts, the wage guarantees, everything in writing. If I fail to deliver, you can take those contracts to any judge in the territory." He looked around the hall. "I can't change overnight, can't undo years of bad decisions with one speech. But I can start, right here, right now, and I can promise you this. I won't give up, I won't walk away. I'll keep trying to be better until I get it right." The meeting ended without resolution. Some people left angry, some left hopeful. Most left uncertain, waiting to see if actions would match words. Over the next 8 months, Eleanor watched her husband transform. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but slowly, steadily, like mountains being worn down by persistent water. Thorn spent mornings at Silver Creek personally overseeing the rebuild. He knew every worker's name, asked about their families, listened to their concerns about safety and fair treatment. The injured workers received exactly what had been promised: full care, full wages, bonuses that helped their families through the difficult months of recovery. The Thorn Charitable Trust opened its doors with the first school in Pine Ridge, a real building with books and desks and a teacher paid a living wage. Children who had learned their letters in a drafty barn now sat in warm classrooms and dreamed of futures their parents had never imagined possible. Newspapers that had crucified Thorn began to tell different stories. Second chances in the mountains. Can a robber baron reform? The new face of Thorn Trading. Word reached them that Victoria Hayes had left Colorado shortly after the wedding, accepting a position with the San Francisco Shipping Company. Eleanor heard later that she had married a banker and seemed content with her new life far from the mountains. The previous winter, a prospector had found Samuel Grant's body in a high mountain pass, frozen beside his horse. The stolen money was still in his saddlebags. The mountains, it seemed, had their own justice. It wasn't all smooth. Some partners left, taking their investments with them. Some workers remained skeptical, watching for the moment when the old Thorn would return. There were setbacks and arguments and moments when Eleanor saw her husband struggle with the temptation to go back to the old ways, the easy ways, the profitable ways that required no conscience. But each time he chose differently, chose harder, chose right, and slowly the territory began to believe. 8 months after the wedding, families gathered at the opening of Morrison Commons. The mixed income settlement had been built on reclaimed land that Thorn Trading had once used for storage. Now it held fresh homes built to proper standards. Gardens grew between the houses. Clean wells provided water. Fair rents meant families could actually afford to live there without choosing between housing and food. At the center stood a community building with a library, meeting rooms, and a playground where children could be children instead of workers. Eleanor spoke first, standing on a temporary platform with Thorne beside her. She explained how the community farms would work, how the resources would be shared, how the rent structure ensured that no one would be forced out if times got hard. "This isn't charity," she said clearly. "This is partnership. Everyone here contributes. Everyone here matters. That's what community means." Then Thorne spoke. His voice carried across the gathered crowd, strong and sure. "None of this would exist without Eleanor Morrison Thorne. 8 months ago, she was a stubborn herbalist who fought me over a warehouse. Today, she's my wife and my conscience, and the reason any of this is possible." He looked at her with open affection. "She demanded I fund 1 school. We've now broken ground on 5. She changed not just me, but the entire meaning of what the Thorne name represents. From profit first to people first. From taking to building. From empire to community." The crowd applauded. Not the polite applause of obligation, but genuine appreciation. People who had been lifted up by the changes. People who were seeing that business could be done differently. Families began moving into their new homes. Children explored the playground. Eleanor stood with Thorne's arm around her waist and felt something settle in her chest. Not just satisfaction, not just pride, something deeper. This was what it meant to build a life with someone, not just sharing a home or a bed, but sharing purpose, creating something together that neither could create alone, becoming partners in the truest sense. Later that evening in the quiet herb garden behind Eagle Ridge Homestead, Eleanor and Thorne sat with Clara. The old woman was in a wheelchair now, too weak to walk even with her cane, but her mind remained sharp and her eyes still saw everything. "I have a confession," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor leaned close. "What is it?" "I knew from the very beginning that your marriage was a bargain." Clara smiled at their expressions. "Did you really think you could fool me? I've known Benjamin since he was born. I know when he's being genuine and when he's performing." "Then why didn't you expose us?" Thorne asked. "Because I also saw something else. I saw the way you looked at Eleanor when you thought no one was watching. The way she reached for your hand without realizing. I saw what you two couldn't see yet. That the bargain was just the beginning. That something real was growing from your lies." Clara reached out with trembling hands and took one of Eleanor's and one of Thorne's. "So I chose to gamble, moved my shares early, nudged a few decisions, created conditions that would force you two to actually face what you felt for each other instead of hiding behind contracts and agreements." "You manipulated us," Thorne said, but there was no anger in it. "I gave you a chance," Clara corrected. "What you did with that chance was entirely up to you. And look what you've built. Not just a marriage, not just a business, a legacy worth having, something that would make Nathan proud." 2 weeks later, Clara Thorne passed away peacefully in her sleep. Margaret and Thomas were with her. She went quietly without pain, with a smile on her face. The funeral drew people from across the territory. Workers and business partners, families from Morrison Commons, teachers from the new schools. People whose lives had been touched by the changes she had helped set in motion. Thorne gave the eulogy. His voice was steady, though Eleanor could see the grief in every line of his body. "My grandmother taught me numbers and how to read clouds. She taught me that business was about people, not paper. She never walked away, even when I was at my worst, even when I became someone she didn't recognize." He paused, fighting for control. "Her last gift was teaching me that love isn't weakness. It's the strongest foundation anyone can build on. Everything good in my life exists because she believed in me when I didn't believe in myself, and because she saw something in Eleanor that I was too blind to see at first." He looked at Eleanor standing beside him. "She brought us together, gave us a chance to find each other, and then she trusted us to do the rest." His voice broke. "I hope we made you proud, grandmother. I hope we're building something worthy of the chances you gave us." Eleanor held his hand as they buried Clara on a hillside overlooking the valley. The mountains stood witness, ancient and patient. The wind carried the scent of pine and coming winter. 3 months after Clara's passing, Eleanor and Thorne stood together on a grassy rise in Wyoming. Stakes marked the outline of their future house, the one they would build on the ranch land that had belonged to Nathan Thorne. The sun slid down behind the peaks in wild western colors of red and gold. Thorne wrapped his arms around Eleanor from behind and rested his chin on her hair. "I've been thinking about names," Eleanor said. "For the house. For the baby." Thorne went very still. Then he turned her around to face him, his eyes searching hers. "Are you sure?" Eleanor nodded, smiling through sudden tears. 3 months along. I wanted to be certain before I told you." He kissed her, then fierce and gentle at once. When he pulled back, there were tears on his face too. "If it's a boy," he asked. "Nathan, after your father." "And if it's a girl?" "Clara, after the woman who bet on us when we didn't know how to bet on ourselves." Thorne pulled her close again, holding her like she was the most precious thing in all the mountains. Eleanor thought back to that day in her herb shop when rough men had dragged her away, when she had believed her life was ending. That terrified woman could never have imagined this. Standing in Wyoming with a husband she loved, pregnant with a child who would grow up in a world built on fairness instead of fear, part of a legacy that mattered. "I was forced to marry you," Eleanor said softly. "I know. I thought it would destroy me. I know that too." She pulled back to look at him, at the man who had been a mountain tyrant and had become someone worth loving, someone who chose right over easy every single day, even when it cost him. "It was the best thing that ever happened to me," Eleanor said. "The best thing that ever happened to both of us." Thorne smiled. It was the smile she loved best, the real one without armor or performance. Just joy and gratitude and love. "Come on," he said, taking her hand. "Let's go home." They walked together down the hillside as the sun finished setting and the first stars emerged. The mountains watched them go, these two people who had started as enemies and become something more, something that would last. Behind them, stakes marked the outline of a house that would stand for generations. A place where children would be born and raised, where love would grow deeper roots than anyone had planned, where two people who had made a cold bargain would build a warm legacy. The wind carried their voices across the valley, and if you listened carefully, you might have heard laughter, joy, the sound of people who had found each other against impossible odds and had chosen every single day to keep choosing each other. In the end, it didn't matter how it started. What mattered was what they built from those difficult beginnings. What mattered was the choice they made to turn lies into truth, performance into reality, convenience into love. The mountains had seen it all before. Two people trying to control something that couldn't be controlled. Two hearts building walls that eventually crumbled. But this time the story ended differently. This time, when the walls fell, what remained was strong enough to last, and that the mountains knew was the only kind of love worth having.